Hey everybody, P.A. Turner, executive producer and host of your Break It Down show. Today's episode is really interesting. Now look, a lot of you know that I'm into presidential history, and so we have Dr. Philip McHugh, and he is from the East Coast. He's a doctor who looks into history. He was at a conference talking about Lincoln, and they were speculating about the antebellum presidents that seemed to have short lifespans either during or after their presidency. William Henry Harrison should come to mind. So, we've always believed these different deaths were caused by different things. Zachary Taylor was, peaches and cream or cherries and cream that had gone bad. But it doesn't follow with what we know about modern medicine now. Polk dies almost immediately after leaving the White House. So you have William Henry Harrison, Polk, and actually Willie Lincoln, a young kid dies in the White House. So why did these things happen? And what Phil and his writing partner figured out was that there was a night soil deposit near the White House. What's night soil? Poop. Back before there was big fancy sewer, you had to put your poop somewhere, and if that got upstream, and if there was any kind of break in the line, all of a sudden you had a contamination problem. And that appears to be the case. So we're going to talk about that. I think it's a fascinating way to look at history and what these things mean, like how it impacts stuff. Like maybe William Henry Harrison would have been a great president. We don't know. And then we got John Tyler. Oh no, what happens then? So you look at these small things that have nothing to do with the presidency and how huge their impact can be on the world. Hey, if you love the show and what we do, 5 shows a week, sometimes more, usually more, it would be great to get your support, whether you're sharing the links or telling a friend about it or buying products. It is awesome when you support it. And I know I see a lot of you guys, Yvonne Oates especially, I see her always, all the time sharing. Mary is wonderful. Brian Tice, all these different people doing things like that. It's fantastic. Please continue to do that. Charlie Cook shares the show all the time. And if I'm leaving somebody out, hey, no offense. I'm just off the top of the cup here thinking about people I see all the time doing that. By the way, we have 2 Charlie Cooks that follow the show. Hey, Charlies, what's up? They both live in cold places, by the way. All right, so anyhow, that's a big help to us. And if you're new to the show, hey, 5 different shows a week, oftentimes more. And then we are going to constantly give you a different race. So one week it might be a politic thing. The next week it might be some kind of fine arts person. And then it might just be some of my friends, the interesting people that I have in my life. Either way, lots of opportunity to hear cool things. And if you don't like this one, the next one's going to be totally different. So you'll dig it. Okay, one last thing. Save the Brave, savethebrave.org. Just go there, take a look around. You don't even got to donate money today. Just take a look around so we get some traffic at the site. And then if you know anybody that has a property that they want to donate it, we would love to be the choice for that. Yep, you can donate property. You can donate shares of stock. You can donate all kinds of things. Time, your attention, your money. You can do errands for a charity. Go out there and do something charitable today. All right, everybody, here comes my man, Dr. Philip Mackowiak.
Lions Rock Productions.
This is Jay
This
Moore.
is Greg Proops.
This is Jordan Harbinger.
This is Dexter from The Offspring.
This is Nathan
This is
East.
Sebastian Younger.
This is Rick Marotta.
This is Stuart Copeland.
This is Mick Gillette.
This is Andy Summers.
Hey, this is Skunk Baxter.
This is Gabby Reese.
This is Rob Bell.
Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero.
Hey, and this is Pete A. Turner.
This is Dr. Philip Mackowiak. You're listening to the Break It Down show.
And now, the Break It Down show with John Leon Guerrero and Pete A. Turner.
Yeah, we have an interesting conversation with Dr. Mackowiak. I'm a bit of a presidential historian. He's a doctor who studies infectious diseases, and he discovered, and I want to get into this deeply, obviously, but there's a kind of a unifying theory to antebellum death in the White House. People like Zachary Taylor, President Harrison, President Polk are all possibly linked to this deposit of night soil. So I thought we'd have the doctor on to kind of get into this. Before we get into what you realized, what was your background in presidential history?
Well, I didn't really have any background at all in presidential history, except for a conference that I did in 2007 on Abraham Lincoln. I have this conference that I host once a year at the University of Maryland School of Medicine, where we consider the mysterious illnesses of famous historical figures to try to come up with a new diagnoses or additional support for old diagnoses as to what was wrong with them. In Lincoln's case, there was no real mystery as to why he died or how he died. The question that was posed in that particular conference was if he'd had access to modern trauma care, could he have been saved? That's what the conference was. So he's the only president that I really was involved in. I got interested in William Henry Harrison serendipitously. This was back in 2000 at the last national census. Jane McHugh was one of the census takers. And she happened to go by my brother's house. We live in the same community. And they got to talking. My brother was a very talkative fellow. She found out from him that I was interested in history. And she said, well, actually, I am trying to write a book on William Henry Harrison. I wonder if I could talk to him about his illness because I don't think the information that is in the record is correct. We took it from there.
Why did you think that the record was incorrect on William Henry?
Well, one of the things that intrigued her was this idea that on Inauguration Day, March 5th, 6th, whatever it was, in 1841, that the weather was horrible. And she looked at the meteorologic data from back then and found that the weather was not that bad. And also, as I vaguely recollect, because I haven't talked to Jane for years, she also wondered about the diagnosis of pneumonia related to exposure, because William Henry Harrison didn't get sick until 3 weeks after he gave his presentation, his inaugural address.
Okay. So it turns out it wasn't that cold, though. And again, do you catch a cold from being outside in the cold? I've been in a lot of cold places. I don't catch a cold when I go outside.
Yeah. Actually, the military studied that many years ago and had two sets of troops. One set, they were careful to not expose them to foul weather, and the other group of troops were subjected to cold and damp and wearing overshoes where their feet overheated and all that sort of stuff. And the incidence of colds was the same in both groups. So exposure to cold per se probably does not predispose the average person to upper respiratory infections, pneumonia, etc.
So that aside, I mean, obviously, because I've always heard that story and thought that just doesn't sound right. It doesn't. You don't catch a cold from being outside. Yeah, you stood outside for a long time. You might catch hypothermia, but to catch pneumonia, someone else, has got to give that to you, or you've got to have some kind of external source. Did you have the same inkling when he talked to you about that, or did it take you a little while to come around to go, yeah, maybe you're right?
Well, it took me a while to come around because I knew absolutely nothing about the medical history of William Henry Harrison, but was very fortunate that she pointed me in the direction of a detailed account of his final illness that was written by his physician, Dr. Thomas Miller. And after I read that, it became clear to me that pneumonia was not his primary problem. That's not to say that he didn't develop a problem with his lungs during the course of this illness, but it was probably secondary to another infection.
And do you think the doctor had an eye on history as he was taking these notes, or were they fairly standard doctor notes for the time?
I'm not sure. I can only speculate that any physician who is taking care of the President of the United States must know in the back of his mind that he will be a footnote in history. And certainly Dr. Miller is a footnote in the history of the death of William Henry Harrison.
Yeah. How was his standard of care? I mean, was he doing what was available back then? Was he better than average?
He did practice standard of care, and it's easy in retrospect, using a retrospectoscope from over 100 years later to criticize what was done, because William Henry Harrison was given a host of toxic medications, one right after another, that you just cringe at when you consider them today. But yes, pretty much they were standard of care.
Yeah.
Having said that, we do similar things today. So William Henry Harrison was first constipated. So he was given enemas and cathartics to try to open up his bowels. And then when his bowels opened up and it looked like he was going to have a flood of diarrhea to the point that it would kill him, medicines were given to try to stop the diarrhea. And this is, to a certain extent, what we do today. Countermeasures. If somebody is too hot, we cool them off. Too cold, we heat them up. If they're too dry, we give them water. If they're too wet, we give them diuretics to take off the water. So future generations will no doubt be just as critical of us as we are of these past generations.
And so it doesn't work. He passes away a month into his presidency. What tips you off to go looking for night soil?
I don't remember, to tell you the truth, Pete. It takes a while to work through these things. And it's not as if you read the account and then you sit down and you write your
my findings. Yes.
Yeah, you write your hypothesis in a paper. And as I was going back and forth with Jane, and we're talking about possibilities, I point out that typhoid fever and paratyphoid fever are pretty much exclusively human disorders. And so that for one human to be infected, they have to have come in contact with the bacterium, usually in the stool of another person with the disease that is contaminated either their water or their food. And so I guess we sort of worked through that idea and wanted to know where the White House got its water supply, and then tracking back there what was in the area that might have contaminated the water supply. And we learned a number of things. One of which was that until the late 1800s, there was no real sanitary system in Washington or any other major cities in the U.S. to deal with human waste. And then we went back further and discovered that this night soil repository, and night soil, of course, is human feces, was located uphill 6 blocks from the White House water supply. It occurred to us that that's a fair distance. However, during torrential downpours, some of which we've had here recently, the water would be flowing downhill from the night soil repository right in the direction of the White House water supply. It made a reasonable explanation for why so many people in the White House were becoming ill with serious illnesses. And when I say people, we know about the presidents. We don't know about the staff.
Right. We
do know that Willie Lincoln in 1862 died of typhoid fever while he was residing in the White House. So it was a huge problem.
So this big problem, let's go back and look at that a little bit. You're right. Cities we look at the different eras of medicine and we live longer in part because things like typhoid fever, tuberculosis, and malaria, they still may kill people, but not like they used to, where it was just rampant in everybody. All of these different infectious things, we've gotten a hold of them, which creates a new set of problems, but we don't sit at our desk and drop dead from a heart attack at 52 years old anymore, So back then, to get rid of feces, they literally had people that came around in the nighttime, grabbed a bucket full of poo or made a bucket full of your poo and took it down to the harbor and dumped it in, or, maybe you had a cesspool in your backyard.
Exactly.
It was everywhere. And then the more crowded the place was, the bigger the problem was. There was not central sewage.
Yeah. I mentioned to you before we started the show that I teach a course in the history of medicine at University of Maryland College Park. And one of the sessions covers public health. If you study the history of medicine and public health in particular, it becomes absolutely clear to you that the reason for the substantial increase in life expectancy in modern times had nothing to do with treatments or surgery, etc. It was sanitation that has made the most significant difference in how long we survived.
Yeah, and I guess that brings us over to Joseph Lister and his developments and realizing, gosh, that doctors are potentially the cause of these things, because back in the olden days, you guys didn't scrub up, put gloves on and everything else. You just put a dirty hand on in there.
Well, Lister, of course, was interested in that, but he was also interested in antiseptic procedures where you killed the germs that had gotten in there. He used carbolic acid, and some historians think he killed as many people as he helped with the carbolic acid sprays that he used in the operating room.
Yeah, well, I guess that's what happened.
The real hero of asepsis is a man by the name of Semmelweis, who was an Austrian who discovered that puerperal sepsis, the sepsis of pregnant women, was related to medical students who were coming from the autopsy room and transferring infections from the autopsy room to the delivery room.
Wow. Yeah. Okay. So we know that there's poo running the streets. It's being kept in cesspools. It's being dumped into the harbor. It's they make these depositories of it. And so not just the White House's water supply, but it must be in everybody's water supply at some point. People must have been dying from typhoid. All kinds of cholera must have been nonstop too.
Yes. In fact, gastrointestinal infections were a plague of cities prior to the advent of modern sanitary techniques. So Polk, who became ill while he was in the White House, but recovered within some 3 months after leaving the White House, he came down with cholera and died of cholera. Those infections were rampant throughout the country, throughout the world.
So we know that William Henry Harrison likely dies of typhus of some kind, paratyphus, typhoid fever. We know that Polk...
No, not typhus, typhoid.
Typhoid. President Polk also dies shortly after and gets sick while he's in the White House. Zachary Taylor turns out not poisoned. We know that because we dug him up and checked. But also... likely it wasn't just, berries and cream that killed him. Same thing, the night soil contamination?
Well, I mean, nobody knows for sure, Pete, but that would be a reasonable hypothesis. And it could be because of the location of the water supply of the White House with respect to the night soil repository, that occupants of the White House were at greater risk of developing these infections than most other people in Washington,
right,
which was the name of the city at the time.
Even without a sewer system, as medical procedures advance over the next 20 years, they do get substantially better. Is this survivable 20 years later without a significant sewer system, or is the problem just worse because there's even more people and more poop?
Could we do as well as we're doing now if we didn't have proper sanitation?
Well, even like 20 years later, if they hadn't have started putting a sewer into the White House and sewers into cities, with the advances of medicine, were we better able to treat these kinds of things?
No, we really didn't come up with an effective treatment until after World War II when antibiotics, the antibiotic age really came into play. And there are plenty of areas of the world, even now, where people are dying of these infections, somewhat because of resistance has developed, but because they don't have access to these modern treatments.
Sure. I know from being overseas with the military, we always wanted to bring fresh water into places, help them dig wells.
Yeah.
But we never thought about the sewer part of it. And it always, and I learned this specifically from a person who was a water expert. He's like, if you bring water in, you have to get water out. You can't just dump it in the river,
Yeah.
And we literally never, ever considered this. Maybe they would cut a cut a little trench and just channel it across the street, and then it would go to the lowest lying spot and be a problem over there, you know?
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. Where were you stationed?
Well, I was in Iraq and Afghanistan quite a bit.
You were?
Yeah. And I dealt with a lot of the public things because my job was to go outside of the camp every day and find out what was going on. And especially in Iraq, where they had water, they just weren't able to treat it well. They're like, and then we have too much water, and now we have all this, all this black water that we have to do something with, and nobody had an answer for them.
Mm-hmm.
And there wasn't going to be a sewer system there anytime soon,
Yeah.
It's even
It's been a principal focus of the military for at least 100 years. So I'm shocked and surprised to hear that.
Yeah, you would go to these villages and they just weren't in any way significantly connected to any kind of a sewer system. You didn't see, you didn't see manhole covers. You didn't see any of that kind of thing. You didn't see gutters and curbs. It was just, it was sort of a century and a half ago.
Turn the clock back.
Yeah. I mean, and this is a modern place that has quite a few things about it that are, modern. And universities and cars and casinos and all these things, you look around and go, like, they got all kinds of things here. But not sewers.
Sanitation is not up to speed.
Now in the city, it's there, but out in the country, it's really not all that common. When you look at these kind of unifying theories, we're like, hey, this night soil thing, what's been the pushback to challenge your guys' position?
I don't see any major pushback in terms of efforts to handle human waste other than the cost of maintaining infrastructure. In Baltimore, for instance, we have water pipes that are made of wood. They're over years old and they're breaking all the time. And in terms of handling waste in repositories, anytime there's a huge downpour, you get contamination of important streams in Maryland because of overflow. Where the real pushback that is obvious has been in immunizations. These groups of people who have been convinced that the vaccines that we use cause things like autism, even though those reports have been substantially discredited, are creating a major disservice to society by advocating against vaccination.
Yeah, we had a doctor from UCSD on, and he talked specifically about that at length and how there's no link to causing autism, anything like that at all from vaccinations. What about the academic pushback? I mean, you're challenging, 150 years of history and what we know to be true. And you're saying, hey, look for the poo. That's the problem.
You're talking about with this article?
Yeah, with the article. I mean, it's been out for a few years now. Like how has the community, how are the historians responding? Have they adjusted to go, yeah, you know what, this is probably right? Or how are they treating it?
Well, actually, I've gotten virtually no feedback other than in looking up William Henry Harrison in Wikipedia. They state categorically that he died of enteric fever, which sort of surprised me. I did in my earlier in my career, my focus was on fever and its clinical manifestations, treatment, etc., and did a study that looked at the relevance of the 98.6 as the normal temperature and showed through some fairly carefully done studies in human volunteers that 98.6 was no special temperature in a normal temperature range of humans. Now there's been pushback, not active, but sort of subtle refusal to accept the fact that 98.6 is not the normal temperature.
Why does it matter? I mean, I don't think mine is ever 98.6. It's always 98 point, not that. And no one goes, "Oh my God, get the crash cart," I mean, don't we just by practice accept that?
Yeah. Human nature looks for simple answers to simple questions, but also complex questions. So you ask a physician, what's the normal temperature as a non-physician? You don't want some prolonged answer about, well, it depends on where you take the temperature. Did you take it in the mouth? Did you take it in the armpit? Did you take it across the forehead? What time of day was it? They don't give me that. Just give me the temperature. What is the normal? The answer is there is no normal temperature. There's a range of normal temperatures that varies according to all those things I just mentioned.
Hey, this is Pete A. Turner from Lions Rock Productions. We create podcasts around here. And if you, your brand, or your company want to figure out how to do a podcast, just talk to me. I'll give you the advice on the right gear, the best plan, and show you how to take a podcast that makes sense for you, that's sustainable, that's scalable, and fun. Hit me up at pete@breakitdownshow.com. Let me help. I want to hear about it.
There is no normal temperature. There's a range of normal temperatures that varies according to all those things I just mentioned.
Just out of curiosity, what's too high where you're like, we need to deal with this right now? And then what's too low?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. In the study that I did with some co-investigators in normal young people, the upper limits of normal and during health was about 100 degrees Fahrenheit.
Wow.
In the early evening. And so technically speaking, any temperature above 100 at any time during the day in a person, and it may vary depending on age, could be thought of as abnormal, possibly a fever. Mm-hmm. Usually in clinical medicine, we don't get excited until it's over 101.
Okay. And then what about the low end?
There, the lower limits of normal, we found as low as about 90, 96. So you get below 96, you start to worry, but you never look at a temperature value in isolation. It's always considered in the context of what's going on with the patient. What's the patient look like? Were they pulled in off the street during the winter, drunk, etc.? And so again, no simple, straightforward answers. Complicated.
Well, and bodies typically, I'm assuming, don't come in too cold very often, and if they are, it's because of exposure. I'm assuming, like if you're at 92 for some reason, there's probably some normal thing, and you'll be back within the zone pretty quickly. Is that fair or no?
Well, no, you wouldn't go that low unless you were you had a temperature regulation problem or exposure, and usually exposure plus some underlying disease such as chronic alcoholism.
So, yeah. but still, like the body tends to get to the right. It's easier for there to be a problem higher up than a problem lower in the temperature range.
I don't know whether it's easier, Pete, but that is sort of a much greater focus of clinicians. Temperature, because low temperatures are relatively uncommon, except in the case of exposure or overwhelming sepsis. Now, for instance, if they had been measuring William Henry Harrison's temperature at the time he died, he could very well have had a temperature that was low rather than high, simply because his systems, his physiological systems, were just collapsing.
Right.
And he couldn't mount an appropriate temperature. And that's a bad prognostic sign.
Right. We had quite a run there of presidents dying about every 20 years or so. And that hasn't happened for a long time. Same thing with first ladies. They tended to, every now and then we would lose one while, serving in the office.
Yeah.
Is that medically not likely to happen anymore? I mean, Harding isn't going to go have a heart attack, most likely. These guys have pretty constant medical care. Or is it always possible, do you think?
Well, I mean, nobody knows, what's in store for them.
Yeah.
It's a important question to ask right now because Ivana or Donald could come down with the coronavirus and drop dead in over the course of a week. I think that having losing a president or a first lady is less likely. I think it's still possible, but that the causes of death have changed substantially.
Yeah.
That enteric infections such as typhoid and paratyphoid would not be a problem in the U.S.
In the
much less.
U.S. Yeah.
Yeah.
Other places, that's not as true.
No, that's other places. It's still a huge problem.
Do you have a sense for how else health has affected the U.S. presidency or history in general? I mean, these kind of, close-knit circumstances like we had in the antebellum days. Is there something else out there that is interesting to you in terms of medical history and history mixing together?
Yeah, I mean, there are a number of things. One is, if you look at the photographs of Lincoln when he entered the office and how he looked just before he was assassinated, he was still a relatively young man, and yet he aged just almost incredibly during that time because of the pressure he was under.
Yeah.
And then look at Trump and look at the pressure he has been under really since he was in office. The impeachment now, the coronavirus, the infighting between the Republicans and the Democrats, with him as the primary target. And yet he looks better than ever. Looks like he is just thriving on this controversy.
Yeah.
That's a medical marvel as far as I'm concerned.
What about someone like Joe Biden who, and I'm not asking you to speculate on his overall condition, but what about someone who appears to have some kind of incapacity creeping up on him? I mean, I've been wondering what's the chances, something greater than zero, that he won't make it to November 3rd. Like, not that he's going to die, but like something will say, I just can't do this, or, he just becomes untenable. That's a real possibility with folks in their late 70s who are running for the hardest job in the nation.
Right. Yeah. Well, he is sort of arriving at the limits of the lifespan of an adult male in the U.S. these days, as is Trump.
Yeah.
But having said that, he could do well into his 90s, and there's just no predicting.
Right.
But you raise an important question, and it will be a special reason to look carefully at who he chooses for a running mate.
Yeah.
Now, whether he is losing it or not, I don't know. I just can't imagine trying to process all the information that a presidential candidate has to have at his or her fingertips at all times, not just during the election, but forever. Trump has handled that beautifully by basically saying, "Well, I never heard that. I didn't know that person, etc." Most other presidents and presidential candidates have been afraid to say they don't know.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, sort of his approach and style has sort of protected him from those things. And like he said yesterday, talking about injecting disinfectants and everything. If you hear what he says and you give him half a chance, you go, obviously he's not saying inject Clorox into the body. But that's not, the news wants to make that sensational thing. Yes, he probably shouldn't have said that. But, are people going to inject things into their body just because the president, talks out loud? I mean, that's what he was doing, right? He was talking out loud. It's a little bit silly.
He has to recognize that he has that power, not because of who he is as a person, but because he's president.
Yeah, you're right about that. I mean, it's really...
Yeah. But the that gaffe and many of his other gaffes bring to mind a very famous quote of Abraham Lincoln, which was, "I would rather not say anything and be thought a fool than open my mouth and remove all doubt."
Yeah. Well, he does not ascribe to that.
No.
He's
No.
constantly opening his mouth and saying things that are regrettable.
Yeah.
Okay, well, what else do we need to know about this really neat piece of history that you discovered? And then, is this the biggest thing you've ever done in your career, do you think? Like, is this your thing? You're like, gosh, I never would have guessed it, but this is what I'm known for.
No, I mean, I've written 3 books on the history of medicine. In 2 of the books, looking at 25 famous historical figures and wrestling in the same way with what their illnesses were. Many of them fatal, but some of them not fatal. And I love them all. So basically what you're saying, what is your favorite? Well, and I've covered every historical figures from King Tut to Eleanor Roosevelt, Pericles and the Plague of Athens. It's been wonderful.
Yeah.
Probably the study of mine that made the biggest splash was the study of the normal temperature of the young humans. The idea that 98.6 is not the normal temperature. That made the international press and a cartoon actually in the New York Times.
Oh, well, and now you have made it.
So that was, but all fame is temporary.
Yeah, that's true. Is there
Sic transit gloria mundi?
Is there that saying has been around for a long time.
Yeah,
not just Andy Warhol, but is there a historical figure who you look at and you go, man, that person, if they would have just survived, like Alexander the Great, if he would have survived that, whatever he had, things might have really been different. Like, if there had been better directions to the hospital, maybe we don't have a World War I,
Yeah. Well, I have 2 answers to that.
Okay.
One is Alexander. When his men forced him back from India, was planning a new campaign around the Horn of Arabia and across North Africa. And in doing that, he would have come in contact with the Carthaginians and the Romans, who were just beginning to emerge as a power. And based on his past record, he probably would have vanquished the Romans, and that would have changed the whole arc of history. Now, with William Henry Harrison, there are 2 things that we mentioned in the paper that might have been different. First of all, he was in favor of a national bank. And if he had remained president, we might have had a national banking system similar to what they have in the UK rather than the Federal Reserve. But he was also against the annexation of Texas. And this is where Jane McHugh's expertise really came to fore in her paper. And she hypothesized that if he had been president, Texas wouldn't have been annexed during his presidency. It would have been later, and it was the annexation of Texas which led to the eruption of antagonism between North and South because of whether or not slavery would be imported into the new territories.
Yeah.
And she felt that that conflict would have been delayed for another 4 years, but who knows what effect that would have had on the outcome of the Civil War.
So what's next for you? What project are you working on now?
Well, I've got two that I'm just finishing up. One is the final illness of George Washington. The standard theory is that Washington suffocated to death because he had an inflamed epiglottis that basically obstructed his upper airway, and that he was pretty nearly bled to death by his physicians. But that was standard of care. So I went back and looked at the primary sources and took issue with all three of those proposals. Number one, he may have had epiglottitis, but he also had two serious abscesses of his thigh 2 years before, 3 years, and then 2 years before he died. And this would imply that he was a carrier of Staphylococcus aureus and that he was prone to abscesses. And so I hypothesize in this paper that he developed a abscess in the back of his throat. I also suggest that his physicians did not provide standard of care because there's no, and they wrote up their description of their care of him because they there's no mention of their ever looking in the back of his throat. And if he had an abscess in the back of his throat, they drained it. And thirdly, I suggest in reviewing a careful review of the medical record that there was no way that he was bled 3.5 liters of blood, which is the standard report from the day, that there is no documentation of that amount taken from him in the primary source. And then with Beethoven, it's his 250th anniversary, and I have written another paper that I plan on submitting as soon as the coronavirus cools down. I hypothesize that his problem, his deafness, and his many other disorders were due to congenital syphilis.
Huh. Wow. Okay. Yeah. Well, you're allowed to be a little bit surly and off and hard to live with if you have always had syphilis.
Yeah, you got an excuse.
You get an out. Yeah. Man, well, that's interesting. So that comes out hopefully in May or June then, huh?
Well, no, I would submit it.
Submit. Okay.
You'd have to find a home.
Right.
Probably wouldn't come out until the winter.
Right. You still got to go through peer review and all of that then, huh?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, listen, I appreciate you coming on and talking about this historical stuff. It's fantastic.
All right, Pete. Enjoyed it.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Best of luck to you.
You too. Bye-bye.